This episode of the History Guy is brought to you by Incogni. Take your personal data off the market.
Today is Illinois Statehood Day. 207 years ago, on December 3rd, 1818, Illinois joined the Union as its 21st state. The largest of the flyover states in 2020, Chicago Magazine made the distinctly less than enthusiastic observation that Illinois is distinct among the states for not being distinct. But the land of Lincoln is known for its politics, and that began at the very beginning. The very Chicago-style path to Illinois statehood deserves to be remembered. It is a wonderful season, but holiday joys can bring holiday woes as the holiday season actually attracts scammers and phishing emails. So thank you, Incogni, for sponsoring this episode of The History Guy. You know, these shady data brokers are constantly collecting, aggregating, and selling your personal information, things like your home address, your email address, even your social security number. And then scammers use that information to craft convincing phishing emails, texts, and phone calls, often playing on your generous spirit during the holiday season.
But you can protect the most wonderful time of the year with Incogni, a convenient tool that tracks down the information brokers that collect and sell your private information and enforces your right to have that information taken down. And I can always see what Incogni is doing on this handy dashboard. And look how much the line goes up as the holidays approach. But that growing line also means that Incogni is continuing to protect me against new threats all the time. And now you can get an extra level of protection. With Incogni's custom removal feature in the Unlimited plan and the Family Unlimited plan, you can point to any people search site or any other website where your personal information is visible, and one of their privacy agents will take care of the rest for you.
Even one unremoved profile can lead to serious risks. So enjoy the holiday season knowing that Incogni has your back. Go to incogni.com/thehistoryguy and use the code thehistoryguy to get an exclusive offer of 60% off. That's incogni.com/thehistoryguy. Use the code thehistoryguy. Get that exclusive offer, 60% off, and enjoy in the holiday season.
Another nickname for Illinois, the Prairie State, is apt. The highest natural point in the state, Charles Mound, described as a gentle hill, is just 1,235 feet above sea level. While many non-Illinoisians tend to think of Illinois as little more than Chicago, the state is actually a top agricultural producer, ranked number one in the nation in production of soybeans and second in corn. And if you enjoy pumpkin pie or a shrimp cocktail, it's the nation's top producer of pumpkins and horseradish. Lesser used historical nicknames include the Corn State and Garden of the West. I'll leave it up to you whether that is a compliment. In 1842, Charles Dickens referred to the plains of Illinois as oppressive in barren monotony. And it might surprise you to find out that the Middle Continent state is much defined by water, being, according to Tom Horgan of the American Waterways Organization, a heavy maritime state. If this is a surprise, understand, for example, that Illinois borders 880 miles of rivers, including a longer length of the Mississippi than any other state, around 575 miles of it. But that also has to do, of course, with Lake Michigan, which from the earliest periods of European settlement defined what is today a U.S. state. The first European exploration of the territory, called Illinois Country, was the 1673 exploration of the Mississippi River by Jesuit missionary Père Marquette and French-Canadian explorer Louis Joliet. The natives they encountered were a loose confederation of tribes called the Illinois. Etymology Online explains that the name Illinois is a francophone transliteration of a Miami word meaning essentially ordinary speaker, and probably refers to the shared language of the tribes of the Confederation.
While conflict in politics would drive pretty much everybody who spoke that language out of their ancestral homelands, it is kind of fitting that the name Illinois means ordinary speaker, as the Midwest accent that represents most of the state is generally considered to be the foundation of standard American English, owing to its clear pronunciation and lack of a strong regional accent.
Early maps actually named Lake Michigan the Lac du Illinois, or the Lake of Illinois. By 1721, the area southwest of the lake, or the whole area claimed by France south of the Great Lakes and north of the mouth of the Ohio, was designated as a military district of Louisiana, called Upper Louisiana, or Illinois Country. The land east of the Mississippi was ceded by France to Britain in the 1763 Treaty of Paris, following the French and Indian War, and then to the United States in the 1783 Treaty of Paris, following the end of the American War for Independence. The area did see fighting in the war, notably in 1777 and 1778 in the Illinois Campaign, led by George Rogers Clark. After the land was ceded, Illinois was initially made part of the vast Northwest Territory. In 1787, Congress defined the conditions for the states to be created from the territory. States so created would have an equal status with existing states. The process would take place in 3 stages. In Stage 1, Congress appoints a governor, secretary, and 3 judges to make laws for a territory. Stage 2 occurs once a territory has 5,000 male settlers, allowing a state legislature to be formed. Stage 3 would come once a territory has 60,000 male settlers, at which point a territory could apply for statehood. Of course, the population first grew in the east, nearer to the established states, and by 1800 the population in the eastern district was growing to the point that it was clear that it was headed towards statehood. In preparation, the territory was divided along a line from the midpoint of the Ohio River, with the land to the east retaining the name Northwest Territory and the new Western Territory, including what is today Illinois, called Indiana Territory. In 1803, a portion of the old Northwest Territory was admitted as the state of Ohio. The same year, the Illinois Wabash Company established an outpost called Fort Dearborn on the site of what is now Chicago. As the territory slowly grew, so did tensions. Residents in the West began to complain, especially after the territory moved into the second stage in 1804. That travel and communication were difficult given the size of the territory, and there was a demand for more local governance. The Indiana Historical Bureau explains, Congress received a number of petitions from Randolph and St. Clair counties in the present state of Illinois, urging a further division of Indiana Territory. The difficulties of travel and communication were cited, but in addition, a resentment against Governor Harrison and a dislike of the second stage of territorial government were apparent. The act, passed by the 10th Congress, defines the new territory. That from and after the first day of March next, all that part of the Indiana Territory which lies west of the Wabash River, and a direct line drawn from the said Wabash River and Post Vincennes, due north to the territorial line between the United States and Canada, shall for the purpose of temporary government constitute a separate territory and be called Illinois. It was not the last time that politics would drive the process. Dr. Jacob K. Freefield of the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library explains on the library webpage that while the act created a place called Illinois and empowered James Madison to appoint Ninian Edwards as governor, in truth the area was controlled by native tribes, as only about 12,000 Euro-Americans resided in the territory. Tara McClellan McAndrew notes in an episode of Illinois Issues in Depth on Illinois National Public Radio that we didn't have the population or infrastructure to be a state. We didn't have settlers clamoring to come here. We didn't even have a burning desire for statehood. What we had was a couple of leaders who didn't let those and other challenges stop them. And as was often the case, it was a family affair. The Popes were a powerful Kentucky family, and William Meese explained in a 1911 edition of the Journal of the Illinois State Historical Society, 2 particular appointments to the new territorial administration came at the recommendation of Kentucky's U.S. Senator, John Pope. One of those was to the office of Territorial Secretary, which went to the senator's younger brother, a Kentucky lawyer named Nathaniel Pope. The other was the appointment of Ninian Edwards, at the time Chief Justice of the Kentucky Court of Appeals and a cousin of the Popes by marriage, as territorial governor. In 1815, Edwards and Pope secured the appointment of Pope's nephew, a young lawyer named Daniel Pope Cook, to a position as the territorial auditor of public accounts. Cook would eventually marry Edwards' daughter. McAndrew writes, Illinois had been its own territory since 1809, when Indiana got congressional permission to separate from us. Territories had weak federal representation and an overly powerful state leader. Our delegate to Congress couldn't vote on national legislation, and our territorial legislation couldn't override our governor. It wasn't a great situation, but not many people complained. Until Daniel Pope Cook. McAndrew quotes the director of the Illinois State Archives, Dave Jones. Cook began pushing for statehood after unsuccessfully seeking a patronage job in the Alabama Territory, and that push came completely out of the blue. Jens describes Cook as a young, ambitious lawyer looking for opportunity. And even though Illinois was what historian Robert Biles of Illinois State University described in his 2005 book on the state history as an unimpressive backwater, Cook began his press to bring Illinois to statehood, aided by his purchase with a partner of the state's first newspaper, then called the Illinois Herald in 1816, renaming it the Illinois Intelligencer. He used the paper as a platform, arguing Illinois state historian Samuel Wheeler notes that statehood would give us equal footing with the rest of the states out east. But of course, there was a problem, as history teacher Todd Johnson writes on his webpage, The History Rat. The settlement of the territory was slow, due in fact to its isolation on the western frontier, but also in part to the climate, access, and the inability to plow the thick prairie soil, not to mention Indians in its northern portions. It did not have, even Governor Edwards admitted, nearly the 60,000 residents required to apply for statehood. So Wheeler explains, Cook came up with a novel argument. The Illinois Territory is destined for statehood, so why delay the inevitable? McAndrew quips, we might have had 60,000 animals, but not humans. So what was a young editor to do? Well, McAndrew notes, Cook, the namesake of what is today Illinois' largest county, along with his uncle, cooked the books. In 1816, Nathaniel Pope had been elected the Illinois representative to Congress. While as a territorial representative he couldn't vote, he still carried weight and was able to gain a significant concession, lowering the population threshold. Wheeler explains Pope sort of uses that argument from Cook that statehood is inevitable. You know they're going to get to 60,000 residents, so why hold them to it at this time? If Illinois can demonstrate through a census that they have 40,000 inhabitants, two-thirds of the required 60,000, by gosh, just let them in. This was not, Meese notes, an official act, but apparently an interpretation of Article 5 of the Ordinance of 1787, which reads, provided the Constitution and government so to be formed shall be republican, and in conformity to the principles contained in these articles, and so far as it can be consistent with the general interest of the Confederacy, such admission shall be allowed at an earlier period, and when there may be a less number of free inhabitants in the state than 60,000. But even 40,000 was a stretch. But again, Pope had a plan. McAndrew notes, he managed another feat. He convinced Congress to let territory officials, instead of the federal government, conduct the population census. Biles writes that census takers counted some settlers several times, including in their tallies migrants passing through Illinois on their way to Missouri, and submitted generous estimates for the populations of isolated outposts in remote areas of the territory. Historian Frank Cicero Jr. noted in his 2018 book, Creating the Land of Lincoln, there were many indications of overzealous census takers that amounted to padding the numbers, if not fraud. Jens opines, we took full advantage of the fact that we were the ones who did the census, and there's no doubt that we didn't have 40,000. Meese writes, the resolution passed by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States on December 3, 1818, declaring Illinois to be one of the United States, does not mention 40,000 or 60,000 population, but is silent on that question. It was in the preparation and passage of this resolution that Nathaniel Pope further proved his statesmanship. The petition of the Illinois legislature praying for statehood was granted, and Illinois, with less than 40,000 inhabitants, through the labors of Nathaniel Pope, was admitted as a state of the Union. With the slight caveat that Illinois wasn't even close to the population requirement came another issue. The original proposal put the northern boundary of the proposed state at the east-west line from the southern tip of Lake Michigan to the Mississippi River. This line has been proposed all the way back in 1787 when the Northwest Ordinance was passed. Erica Janik explains on Wisconsin Public Radio in 2015. In the late 18th century, when American leaders were envisioning the expansion of the fledgling United States, they drafted a plan for how new states might be added to the Union. Their plan for surveying territories and states envisioned a line through the southernmost tip of Lake Michigan, straight out to the Mississippi River. This is interesting in that that meant that the new state would have no port on the lake, once named Lake du Illinois. Roger Flaherty notes in the Chicago Sun-Times in 2017. The future Chicago, Waukegan, Rockford, Galena, and other points north were to remain part of the yet-to-be-established Wisconsin Territory. Rachel Otwell explains on Illinois Public Media in 2014. While most people hear Illinois and think Chicago, it could have been without the city, if not for advocacy and politics. Flaherty explains the concern among Northerners was that an Illinois so shaped could well attach to the slave states of the South. An Illinois existing only south of Lake Michigan would naturally develop ties with the South thanks to commerce along the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, it was feared. Otwell quotes Professor Kenneth Olson, who teaches natural resources and environmental science at the University of Illinois. It was a straight line that had nothing to do directly with water, except the line was moved because they wanted to link the Great Lake watershed and shipping with the Mississippi River. Plato explains that Pope argued that keeping the port of Chicago within the new state would strengthen its ties with states in its east. He also noted that a proposed canal linking the Illinois River to the great freshwater sea, Lake Michigan, would not only open up new channels of trade, but would tend to bind together the East and West by a community of interest. It was a long shot. In his 1882 History of Illinois, John Moses wrote, "The securing of the adoption of the amendment, fraught with such material results, was one of his own motion and his own responsibility, without the instruction or advice of his constituents." Cicero writes, "No one else in Illinois even knew about it until days later." The idea was driven by a political imperative, as Janik explains. At the time, slaveholding southern states and free northern states were wrestling for control of Congress. Whenever a state entered the Union, then the North hustled for a free state to compensate for the imbalance. Mississippi, a slave state, entered the Union in 1817, so the North needed another state. Pope was deft in his argument before Congress. If her commerce is to be confined to that great artery of communication, the Mississippi, which washes her entire border, and its chief tributary to the south, the Ohio, there's a possibility that her commercial relations with the South may become so closely connected that in the event of an attempted dismemberment of the Union, Illinois will cast her lot with the southern states. On the other hand, to fix the northern boundary of Illinois upon such a parallel of latitude as would give the state territorial jurisdiction over the southern shores of Lake Michigan would be to unite the incipient Commonwealth to the states of Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York in a bond of common interest, well nigh indissoluble. By the adoption of such a line, Illinois may become, at some future time, the keystone to the perpetuity of the Union. In that statement, Cicero notes his prescience was confirmed by subsequent events. In fact, Olson argues that the decision foreshadowed a war that would come 4 decades later. Congress wanted to have a water route between the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River for shipping supplies and soldiers if needed, since the Ohio River route could become contested. But how could a non-voting member of Congress manage such a change? Jens argues that I always say that Washington had no idea what they were doing when it came to Illinois, because Nathaniel Pope is the first perfect Illinois politician. Thus, it was through the maneuvering of just a few, shall we say, interested parties that Illinois was created. As McAndrew writes, it might have been premature. Frankly, we were an upstart, like a kindergartner who thinks he's ready for high school. But the decision would have significant ramifications. Mick Zawasak writes in a 2018 edition of the Jacksonville, Illinois Courier-Journal, Pope's move provided the groundwork for Chicago to become Illinois' economic juggernaut and turned state politics upside down as the area grew. And the impact might have been even larger. For example, the creation of the Republican Party and one of its most famous and historically important representatives. Cicero argues that without the border change, the new Republican Party, formed in 1854, would not have rested on the favorable conditions in northern Illinois that enabled it to elect all the state officers in 1856, when all the popularly elected state offices in 1858, and when the popular vote for state offices and the popular vote and electoral college votes for Abraham Lincoln in 1860. The votes to give margins of victory to Illinois Republicans in those 3 election years and to Abraham Lincoln in 1860 came from the 14 counties and 8,500 square miles added to Illinois at the time of statehood. But the change had another effect, as Zawasak writes. How Illinois' northern boundary was designated 42 degrees 30 minutes latitude was a tactical maneuver that effectively set Wisconsin statehood back 30 years. Flaherty explains the meaning to the residents of Chicago. We could have been cheeseheads.
The creation and borders of all the states had their politics involved. A conflict over the border between Ohio and Michigan actually also cost Wisconsin, as the Upper Peninsula was added to Michigan instead of to Wisconsin. A conflict over the border between Missouri and Iowa almost resulted in war, but rarely has such a monumental, important decision that defined the nation been driven by such a small group of people who are so nearly forgotten in history. Cicero notes that Nathaniel Pope is uncelebrated among the founding fathers and state heroes of Illinois. Daniel Pope Cook was elected to Congress representing the state that he had done so much to carve from the wilderness. He served from 1819 to 1827 and died later that year. Nathaniel Pope was appointed to the United States District Court for the state of Illinois, served from 1819 until his death in 1850. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop, book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.